You want to tell me you saw Norman Bates' mother?
But it had to be. Because Arbogast said so, too.
Well, if the woman up there is Mrs. Bates, who's that woman buried out in Green Lawn Cemetery?
I don't know, but it isn't Mrs. Bates. Her son Norman keeps her body in a rocking chair in his house while he dresses up in her old clothes while killing someone the audience was supposed to think was the star of the movie. And spoilers for the following Scooby-Doo film.
It's the witch's ghost. She's what we fear the most.
While solving a mummy museum mystery, the gang are aided by famous horror novelist Ben Ravencroft, who invites them to his home in New England. Promised a quiet, peaceful time in rustic Oakhaven, they are instead met by an influx of tourists eager to encounter a new resident of the town, the spirit of a centuries-old witch, returned from the grave to seek revenge on the world that persecuted her. When it comes to villains, Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost is an outlier, in that it features not one, but two villain schemes, independent of each other.
Listen, Velma, I'm going back to my hometown in Massachusetts this weekend. Why don't you and your friends come visit?
In this scene, there is less traffic outside a major New England city than my small Midwestern town on a Tuesday night. The first plot involves several of Oakhaven's most prominent citizens, including the mayor, who concocted a scheme to increase visitors to their new historical Puritan village by faking the ghost of a notorious witch who had purportedly terrorized the town back in the 17th century. This plot was in somewhat bad taste, as the witch in question, Sarah Ravencroft, was an ancestor of Ben Ravencroft, who did not appreciate the town cashing in on his family's name.
Who are you? I don't believe it. You're Ben Ravencroft, the famous horror writer.
I devoted an entire video to how Ben Ravencroft was essentially Stephen King, so I'll do my best not to rehash that here. But he is totally Stephen King. The Oakhaven business people were somewhat redeemed later when it was revealed that the second and more dangerous of the two villain plots in the film was perpetrated by none other than Ben Ravencroft, who was secretly a witch himself. He desired his ancient ancestor's spellbook in the hopes of freeing her from a magic prison and using her powers to take over the world. Since we're dealing with two separate villains with two separate objectives, I've decided to rank them both in this video. I debated including Sarah Ravencroft as a third one, but she's not really a Scooby villain here as much as she's a malicious force of nature, albeit a sentient one. Putting her on the same level as Ben Ravencroft and Mayor Corey would be like treating the nuclear missiles at the end of Superman the movie as equal to Lex Luthor and Otis.
Did you say Puritan Village?
What you're seeing is a perfect recreation of what life was like back in the 1600s.
When did all this go up?
About 6 months ago.
Why was this a surprise to Ravencroft? He said earlier that he returns every year to his house in Oakhaven. The Puritan village is not something the town would have been able to build in a month or two. It had to have been in the planning stages for years, so it's unlikely the horror novelist wouldn't have known about it before now. The mayor said it was put up 6 months earlier, which would mean for Ravencroft not to have known about it, they would have had at most only another 6 months to design the village and secure construction crews to build it, as well as to presumably hire 17th century experts to train the townspeople to run the place. This doesn't even touch on obtaining needed zoning variances and grant applications, holding town meetings, etc. It took my small town several years just to build a YMCA. In addition to Mayor Corey, the town of Oakhaven's fake witch plot was the work of pharmacist McKnight, restaurant owner Jack, hardware store owner Willard, and bed and breakfast owner Molly Parker. They took advantage of the legend of Sarah Ravencroft by having McKnight dress up as her ghost to appear in the evenings to draw in tourists eager to see the apparition. As far as designs go, this was reasonably risk-free, provided they kept their shenanigans under control. Whether or not they did, I'll discuss later. The reason it wasn't that dangerous is because it's unclear what crime, if any, they would be guilty of if unmasked. Again, provided they didn't go overboard. Dressing up as a ghost to scare people isn't illegal in and of itself. It's your intentions or what you do while disguised that determines if a crime may have been committed. For example, dressing up to go trick-or-treating isn't illegal and often encouraged by most towns as a wholesome way of bringing a community together. Dressing up as a monster for the purpose of frightening people away from a hidden treasure or to abandon their homes, on the other hand, would likely be considered criminal intimidation. In the case of McKnight, his costume was intended to increase visitors to the town, so it's unlikely they'd be charged with that crime. The only criminal classification for their scheme I could think of would be fraud, as they were attempting to enrich the town, and thus themselves, by faking a supernatural occurrence to draw tourists in under false pretenses. This is such a minor violation that it's difficult to believe any serious legal authority would bother filing charges. However, it's extremely possible that a visiting tourist eager to see a ghost might be willing to file a lawsuit against the town for false advertising. This, though, would be a civil matter, not criminal, so the likelihood of seeing prison by any involved was slim to none. Even if they were taken to court, the parties would more than likely settle for a token amount of damages, and Oak Haven would still show a profit from the scheme. Remember, I'm not a lawyer because I do cast reflections in mirrors, so this is all supposition on my part based on common sense and what little experience I've had with the legal system. Laws vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, so perhaps in some parts of the country, what Corey, McKnight, and the rest did was illegal. The greedy business owners do get kudos for one of the more original villain schemes in the Scooby-Dooverse, considering that most of the time, those dressing up as a ghost or monster are determined to frighten others away, whereas it was the complete opposite this time around. I'm giving them a design score of 4 out of 5. Their ghost scheme was low risk, though I must stress low risk just in terms of design. It was also shown to be profitable by easily increasing their tourism trade. Turning now to Ben Ravencroft, his scheme was much more elaborate, but that stands to reason as his goal had significantly higher stakes than merely booking more guests at a bed and breakfast.
I've already searched the area around that tree, but never found anything. That book could finally prove Sarah's innocence and that she was a Wiccan, not an evil witch.
Having spent years in a fruitless search for a spellbook that imprisoned his powerful evil ancestor, Ravencroft hatched a brilliant scheme to obtain the aid of a group of accomplished young mystery solvers to find the book for him. Uh-oh. Another museum and a Scooby episode. I wonder if those dinosaur bones know the danger they're in.
Where are you? We need some help from you now. Come on, Scooby-Doo, I see you, pretending you.
Called it. At least it wasn't entirely Scooby's fault this time.
And Scooby-Doo, if you come through, you're gonna have yourself a Scooby snack. That's it.
The Scooby Gang was easily the worst thing to happen to museums until Ken Ham. After researching the Scooby Gang, Ravencroft knew they wouldn't be willing to help him in his quest if his real intentions were known, so he decided to lie about the witch, claiming Sarah Ravencroft was merely a gifted healer persecuted by superstitious Oak Haven residents back in the mid-17th century. Hoping to prove her innocence, Ben claimed the spellbook he was searching for was actually a journal of Sarah's patients, and thus would prove she wasn't a witch. Ben Ravencroft knew the gang couldn't resist a mystery, so he concocted a plan involving mummies haunting a museum so he could, coincidentally, encounter Fred and the rest, making his invitation to join him at his residence in Oakhaven feel natural and not contrived, hopefully catching them off guard so they would willingly locate the spellbook. His overall goal was, of course, freeing Sarah Ravencroft from her magical prison and using her powers to take over the world.
Apparently, we disturbed the spirit of Ben's ancestor who was persecuted as a witch way back in 1657.
This isn't necessarily a goof, but as much of a fangirl as Velma is shown to be for Ben Ravencroft, it's surprising she didn't already know that one of his ancestors was accused of witchcraft. Ben Ravencroft gets high marks for prep work and how valuable his plot was worth, but the originality, on the other hand, is somewhat lacking. There was already an episode of Scooby-Doo from the early 1970s that involved an evil man with a beard who freed a malevolent magical being from a small object so he could use the spirit's powers for his own designs.
I orchestrated the whole mummy scheme, paying off the archaeologists and the security guards just to lure you to the museum so we could meet.
In terms of risk, Ravencroft's plan was on par with the business owner's scheme. While bribing archaeologists and security guards to run amok must skirt the law somewhere, the only real damage done in the museum was to a few of the exhibits. A competent lawyer could likely plead that down to simple criminal mischief and avoid the more serious conspiracy charges. The author was famous and wealthy enough that the odds of prison time were slim to none. It would be an option for the museum to pursue matters in civil court, but Ben or his publisher could easily cut them a check. Ravencroft didn't even risk damaging his reputation if caught because, as we've learned many times over the years, if you're famous, your fans will give you a lot of leeway for being awful.
Awful people.
In fact, if it came to light that a renowned horror novelist was exposed trying to find a spellbook that housed the spirit of his evil sorceress ancestor, his book sales would probably increase. Ironically, this is a situation where the riskiest aspect of the plan wasn't in getting caught, but rather if it actually succeeded. Had Sarah Ravencroft been a genie with the established lore of being bound to the will of whoever released her from her prison, that would be one thing. But how could someone as intelligent as Ben Ravencroft think that an evil witch who had been locked up in a magical prison to keep her from destroying the world would be the kind of spirit to share the limelight, let alone bow to the wishes of anyone weaker than she was? The Wicked author gets a 4.5 out of 5 for his design. Though not original and kind of dumb when you consider the danger to the perpetrator if successful, Ben Ravencroft still gets credit for all the work he put into it, while the chance it offered him to literally rule the world overwhelmingly made it worth the trouble and risk. I'm in my early 50s and am clearly not in shape to run any marathons, so this gives me, I think, some fairly good insight as to the problems with the costume chosen by the Oakhaven business people. The design itself is fine and as scary as can be reasonably expected for a witch. Of all the monsters in supernatural folklore, witches tend to be in the lower ranks when it comes to how frightening their appearance can be. They're typically depicted as old crones with wrinkly skin and large warty noses. There are plenty of innocent non-witches who look like that, and frankly the stereotype is insultingly ageist. Worse, what are you going to do if the person you're trying to scare off is into gilfs? You didn't think that one through, did you? I mean, to be fair, the real witch has kind of a rockin' bod.
This town shall pay for what it did to me!
McKnight's costume did feature impressive special effects like being able to toss fireballs and flying, though the latter is not without some inconsistencies.
This town will pay!
Like we followed the mayor to some warehouse, and that ghost attacked us.
He did? There goes my cherry picker theory.
It's revealed at the end that the fake ghost was being dangled from a cherry picker, but this only explained the ability to fly outside. In fact, when Shaggy and Scooby recounted how the witch had chased them indoors, Velma explicitly stated this would rule out the cherry picker. Yet that's how the flying effect was explained at the end. We never learn how the witch managed to fly inside the storage building. The worst aspect of the outfit, though, had to be the physical requirements needed to use it. Whoever is wearing the costume not only had to be able to convincingly shriek as the witch, as well as hurl the fireball effects, they had to be hoisted by the cherry picker and flown through the streets. Though looking to be at least in his mid-50s or older, McKnight's actual age was never established. However, he was obviously not a young man. As a pharmacist, he probably didn't have any circus training either. This entire setup was extremely dangerous, considering if something happened to the line attached to the cherry picker, or if the truck came to an abrupt stop, McKnight could be seriously injured. Hell, I once gave myself a cramp in my calf while yawning and ended up limping for 2 weeks.
2 weeks?
Help me! I've fallen and I can't get up!
In fact, I'm so old, I remember when this reference Velma made was still fresh.
Now!
The way McKnight was caught at the end could have resulted in serious injury or death. In fact, there's no way he should have escaped having at least a few broken ribs. But if we stay in Dooniverse, this is evidence that he was in good enough shape to tackle the rigors of the fake ghost disguise. Not original or scary, but with good special effects, I'm awarding the fake ghost of Sarah Ravencroft with an outfit score of 2.5 out of 5. I'm setting aside how dangerous it was for the older man to don the costume, as it didn't result in any injury to him, despite the violent way in which he was caught. Ben Ravencroft's outfit score is going to be tricky. In the past, on the rare occasions when there wasn't a villain or they didn't wear a disguise, I often left it at a neutral score so it wouldn't affect their final ranking one way or the other. However, this time around, I'm going to delve a bit deeper into the writer's persona.
She was a Wiccan.
Say what?
I've read about them. Wiccans were people who were in tune with the forces of nature and used them for healing purposes.
As mentioned in my previous video, Wicca wasn't really a thing until the early 20th century.
You know, doing research on Sarah and the Wiccans led me to read almost everything about the world of superstition. That's how I started writing stories to frighten people.
Working under the lie of wanting to prove her innocence, Ben Ravencroft likely spent his entire life researching Sarah Ravencroft and witchcraft, with the goal of locating her spellbook to set her free. Doing so gave him the knowledge to achieve success as a horror writer. This would provide adequate cover for researching the occult, with fame allowing him access to private libraries all over the world. Who would guess that he was an actual witch with an evil agenda?
I have read all your books, which, in my opinion, are the best horror stories ever written. And that scene at the end where the caretaker's flesh dissolved was so brilliant,
Oh, look, we're here.
Already?
I wanted to ask her where she hid her journal.
That's great.
Wonderful.
I'm in. Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry. You lied to me, Ben.
Well, gee, I had to. Yes, Velma. I tricked you into helping me. And it worked.
How could I have ever liked your novels?
Ravencroft also spent most of the film being warm and friendly to the gang, particularly Velma, who he had to have known was obviously harboring a crush on the older man, making his ultimate betrayal that much worse. This is the second film in a row to feature this aspect, as Fred clearly had some feelings for Lena in Zombie Island, making her heel turn hit that much harder. I'm going to consider genial horror novelist as Ravencroft's disguise. Indeed, later on, when he removes his glasses after getting the spellbook, it's thematically like being unmasked. However, as a Scooby villain, this disguise is a complete bust. It's not scary, or at least it's not nearly as scary as the real-life inspiration, and there were no special effects. Though having a friend to the gang eventually exposed as being evil has happened both before and after, It's still rare enough for Ravencroft to get plenty of points for being a villain successfully hiding in plain sight. Thus, he gets a 2.5 out of 5 for the outfit. Did I just waste a bunch of time arguing Ravencroft deserved a score for wearing a costume when he just ended up getting the same score as if he hadn't been wearing one at all? I would like to take a moment to thank my new Patreon member and apologize in advance if I mispronounce the name. Hollow of Londor. Thank you, Hollow of Londor. Thank you to everyone helping support my channel. It absolutely means the world to me. If you'd like to help, there's a link to my Patreon page below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. New members get a personal thank you in the next regular video I upload after they join, as well as credits in each regular video for as long as they remain a paid member. Did the Oakhaven business owners really need to invent the witch to increase tourism? Or rather, did they have to go through with the entire scheme the way they did? It's obvious the whole point of the Puritan village was to bring tourists to the town and make money, not to provide an educational experience. They took advantage of what was available to them, mainly Oakhaven's 17th century historical significance. Had the town been in rural Georgia, they might have recreated antebellum plantation life. It's not like Mayor Corey and the rest had a sense of shame. So with this anything for a buck mentality, why didn't the business owners embrace the whole scary witch aspect from the start? Why did they wait until after the village was built to concoct the Sarah Ravencroft connection when they should have embraced it from the beginning, centering their entire theme on the legend? Oakhaven was clearly inspired by Salem, Massachusetts, and the famous witch trials that had occurred there, and that real-life town has no issues with milking their problematic history for all it's worth. The business owners should have hired actors to dress openly as Sarah Ravencroft, touring the town and cursing visitors, just like how mascots wander around Disneyland interacting with guests. They could have even staged regular shows of the witch attacking the town at set times throughout the day, much like how theme towns based on the Wild West often stage hourly fake gunfights. Those fireballs barely missed Shaggy. In fact, if he hadn't dodged, they absolutely would have hit him. For all we know, Corey and the rest could have originally proposed the concept of a haunted village attraction, but were shot down by the town lawyer or insurance company as being too reckless to implement. This might explain why they went with the idea of a real historical Puritan village being haunted by a real spirit. Who would a tourist sue if they got singed by a fireball, or tripped and broke their leg fleeing from a flying witch? If their injuries didn't occur during an officially sanctioned event, it might be easier for Oakhaven to defend itself in court, shielding the organizers from legal liability.
Mayor, tell Jack that anything they order is on me.
You're gonna regret that offer, Ben.
He may be the bad guy, but you have to feel sorry for Ravencroft here. At this point, the gang has no reason to suspect him of being evil. So aren't they kind of assholes for not giving him a heads up about Shaggy and Scooby's eating habits? Then again, he supposedly researched the group, which is why he dragged them into this affair in the first place. So perhaps Ravencroft already knew what he was getting into.
I've got a nice juicy ham bone for your dog. What do you think?
Bone? Nah, Scooby's allergic to bones.
What? Allergic? How many dinosaur exhibits has Scooby-Doo ruined because of his obsession with bones?
It was great, especially those last 12 pies.
Glad you liked him.
Why does Jack look so unhappy? If you ran a business and sold out your entire inventory, wouldn't that mean you made a bunch of money? Sure, it's going to be a pain to restock, but that's like whining about all the taxes you owe after winning a lottery. Of course, in the end, Ravencroft did wind up getting trapped in a spellbook for all eternity, so poor Jack likely never got paid for all the food Shaggy and Scooby ate. But he doesn't know that yet.
Thorn seems like the leader. Let's follow her.
Are Are you sure you're not just stuck on Thorn, Freddy?
I'm with Fred. That one sucked.
Ah, young love.
Setting aside where they got the clothes, hat, and wig, this is another example of how Scooby usually plays the girl in these moments. Maybe there was a reason he was so jealous of Shaggy and Velma's relationship in Mystery Incorporated. It's understandable why the mayor, the restaurant owner, and the lady who ran the bed and breakfast would want to see more tourists visit Oakhaven, but what benefit would the hardware store or pharmacy gain from that? Both of those businesses would likely cater more to residents, not visitors. What tourist would need to buy a wrench, fix some plumbing, or have a key made? And would someone driving hours away to visit an attraction wait until they got there to have their insulin prescription filled? It's a bit of a stretch, but the hardware store might benefit from more visitors in town, considering shelf space could be set aside for items like film or camping gear. But how would McKnight the pharmacist benefit from an increase in tourists? If he ran a traditional pharmacy, like from back in the 1950s with a soda fountain, maybe having more people around could be a benefit, but it still doesn't seem reasonable to expect his sales to increase by that much. I am willing to concede that the Puritan Village could have been built through investment money, and Mayor Corey, McKnight, Jack, and the rest were co-owners of the place and thus needed the tourism boost to keep it from folding. I just think the film could have done a better job of fleshing out why they were desperate enough to resort to costume shenanigans. I've already touched on the danger McKnight put himself in while disguised as the fake witch, but it bears repeating. Of all the conspirators, it's obvious why he was the one who had to wear the Sarah Ravencroft costume, but wouldn't it have made more sense to hire someone younger and in better shape for the dangerous stunt work needed to make the witch fly? Did McKnight really have that much of his personal capital invested in the failing Puritan Village that this seemed like a good idea to him? Had he been hurt, how would he explain that to the hospital or his insurance company? At the high rate of speed he was being driven through the air, if anything had gone wrong, McKnight faced serious life-threatening injury. Would he tell the attending physician at the emergency room he had fallen off a ladder, assuming he was still in good enough shape to be able to speak if his line snapped while traveling 30 miles per hour through the air?
Hey, check out these branches. They were all broken from the tops of these trees.
And in a perfectly straight line.
Instead of neatly trimming the tops of the trees like that, wouldn't the cherry picker arm have instead come to an abrupt stop upon hitting the first tree, resulting in McKnight being tossed around like a scout in the hands of the female Titan? Unless, of course, the truck was traveling so quickly the bucket acted like a razor blade. Neither of which sounds like a healthy position for the older man to find himself.
What are all these tire tracks doing back here?
Strange. The road's back there.
Right. Let's see where these tracks lead. Jinkies, it's the mayor.
The Oakhaven business people were very sloppy in handling the cherry picker. Not only did they destroy the tops of the trees, suggesting to the gang that the flying witch may not have been a supernatural origin, but tire tracks were also left behind to lead Velma and the others directly to the vehicle in question. Corey, McKnight, and the rest clearly bit off more than they could chew with their villain scheme. While initially successful at increasing the number of tourists visiting Oakhaven, their plan itself was dangerous and mostly impractical, especially for McKnight. He was the town pharmacist, so when was he going to sleep if he spent his days running his legitimate business and his nights dressing up as a fake ghost?
Well, I, for one, am totally shocked by this deception.
You can stop the charade now, Mayor.
The next few town hall meetings are probably going to be pretty awkward. Hey, Mayor, remember that time you tried saving yourself by throwing the rest of us under the bus?
We saw you perform some kind of ritual in your shed.
And that ritual you saw was just peppermint and cloves to soothe my vocal cords.
Cloves to soothe a sore throat? I'd rather swallow broken glass. My grandmother once gave me a clove to eat as a child. I haven't visited her grave even once.
But what about your fangs?
My dad's a dentist. He outfitted the band.
Lunch! Ah!
Fake teeth like that are notorious for making it difficult to speak, let alone sing. While it's true that skilled orthodontic experts can craft prosthetics in such a way that they won't interfere with the movement of the tongue inside the mouth, they're not usually full veneers and rather just small caps for the fangs, which is all the Hex Girls really needed. To be fair to the Oak Haven business people, their idea of having the spirit of Sarah Ravencroft drum up more visitors was last minute, the result of desperation to save their failing Puritan village. But this only further accentuates how bad they were at planning. Mayor Corey and the rest get an operation score of 2 out of 5. How does Ben Ravencroft stack up in comparison to his neighbors at being a villain? His motivation was certainly much more nefarious. The Oak Haven business people were merely in it for the money, whereas Ravencroft was after the world, and his later actions showed a level of cruelty that meant his achieving domination over the rest of humanity wouldn't be peaceful. In fact, had he managed to secure control over all the countries on Earth, his reign would likely have been marked by torture and madness. That's a pretty dark theme for Scooby-Doo, but is it any darker than murdering thousands for immortality?
Oh, it's Perkins!
And Griswold, disgruntled archaeologists from the museum's Babylonian project.
Like that's a twist.
What had to have been going through the minds of those archaeologists and security guards when Ben Ravencroft approached them for his scheme? Imagine you're just sitting around your office in the museum and Stephen King walked in and dropped a wad of cash on your desk and asked you to dress up as a monster to scare a group of young adults. Also, what would the aftermath have been for those guys? Ravencroft said he bribed the archaeologists and the security guards, but he didn't say anything about the museum curator. That man appeared to be completely innocent and not involved with the rest. So as far as he knew, 2 of his associates were taken away in handcuffs by 2 other associates. What would he start to think a week or 2 later after realizing the police never contacted him for a statement? There was actual damage done to displays in the museum. As the curator, he would have to report what happened to the director, who would then have to report to the Board of Regents, as well as to contact whatever insurance company issued their policies. All these individuals would need to see a police report that was never going to come. Further, what plan did the archaeologists have for afterward? It's not like they could return to the museum or get a job at another one, considering any hopes for future employment would be dashed by a single phone call to their last position asking for a reference. What about the security guards? What would they tell their supervisors upon being asked why the police hadn't been in contact with the museum for their investigation? We see a flashback showing Ravencroft paying off the men. Each gets a single stack of cash, and if we assume those are all $100 bills, that's likely $10,000 each. In today's money, that would be close to just under $20,000. Just like today, in 1999, that wasn't even enough to buy a new car. Even if Ravencroft promised the men half now and half later, we're still talking an amount that by no stretch of the imagination would be enough to retire on. The archaeologists and security guards still needed to find work, and their association with the horror writer was going to seriously impact their lives going forward. Or would it? The museum caper had 11 people involved. 4 were young adults with no permanent address, 1 was a literal dog, and 1 was a famous novelist who would soon become an unsolved missing persons case. This left the 4 criminals and a single innocent witness left behind to answer questions from his superiors. Once the gang and Ravencroft left, did the 4 men meet with the curator later to threaten him to keep his mouth shut about what happened earlier in the evening? They could either try bribing him as well, or merely explain that it was in his best interests to play along with whatever cover story the 4 were coming up with to save their jobs. After all, it would be the word of 4 men against 1. With no one remaining to corroborate the curator's version of events, he would be forced to agree. After all, the only damage done at the museum was a collapsed dinosaur skeleton, a dislodged tapestry, and a destroyed medieval rack. The tapestry could be easily reattached to the wall, and the fact that the museum featured an Iron Maiden.
Iron Maiden? Excellent!
A device that's been mostly discredited as an actual historical artifact, means the other torture implements were suspect as well, and possibly just a modern recreation worth little more than the cost of having it built by a modern carpenter. As for the clapped skeleton, that's the easiest one to explain. After all, the museum was visited earlier by 4 young adults and a dog, a group that matches the description of a teenaged gang that institutions all over the country know as habitual dinosaur skeleton destroyers. In the end, the poor curator would likely have no recourse but to accept the circumstances he was in and do his best to help with the cover-up. Fortunately, we're not talking about murder, so his conscience might be uneasy, but it's not like he should lose too much sleep at night. Although running into each other in the break room going forward was going to be awkward. Ravencroft's museum haunting was unnecessarily convoluted, almost to the point of ridiculousness. If the sole reason to stage that fake villain scheme was to have an excuse to meet the Scooby Gang and invite them to his home in Oakhaven, why didn't Ravencroft simply ask them?
Why go through this elaborate scheme? Why not just ask us to find the book? I know why. Because if we knew what that book was, we would never have helped him.
Ben Ravencroft still could have asked the gang for help, but just not told them it was a spellbook he was looking for. He was already using the cover story that the book was a journal cataloging Sarah Ravencroft's patients, hoping it would rehabilitate her legacy. That story would have worked on the gang. It did work on the gang. And it's not like they would have ignored Ben Ravencroft's request for help. The Scooby Gang are mystery solvers. That's what they do. We've already seen them willing to drive across the country to help with a ghost before. A world-famous horror writer would be near or at the top of the list of people for whom they would immediately answer the call, especially Velma, who ran a mystery bookstore in this iteration. The fake museum mystery was not only a waste of time and money, but it introduced a very real risk of involving far too many people in the scheme. What would Ravencroft have done if at the last minute one of the archaeologists or guards had a change of heart? Or demanded more money?
I was hoping to have a little chat with my ghostly ancestor. I wanted to ask her where she hid her journal.
Boy, Ben seems to be pretty obsessed with that book.
I'll say.
Ravencroft might have gone a little overboard with how much he obsessed over the missing spellbook, enough so that even Fred and Daphne felt it was peculiar. However, this wasn't a mistake on his part. If anything, it showed just how important it was for him to prove his ancestor's innocence. However, in the end, his obsession with the book did prove to be his undoing.
Shaggy, do you still have that little shoe buckle Scooby found today? Scooby, can you show me exactly where you found this? The box!
Wait a minute. If that's the buckle from Sarah Ravencroft's book, how did it end up outside the box? But when they did find the book, there was a buckle on it. I suppose it's possible the buckle Scooby found actually was from a shoe, and it reminded Velma about the one she saw on the book in the painting, and she associated it with the giant stump. Except she had to ask Scooby where he found it. Did she think it came from the book and just happened to get lucky that the shoe buckle was lost in the same spot where the chest was buried?
Ben, that doesn't seem to be a journal at all.
Because it isn't, Velma. It's a spell book.
This is my favorite line in the entire movie. Tim Curry f***ing nailed it. It's a spell book. Just chew that dialogue up. Nom 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 nom. Why didn't Ravencroft wait until he was alone before opening the chest? He was excited, certainly, and perhaps his error in judgment could be forgiven. Except up to this point, he had been extremely careful and calculating, never once letting his real design slip in front of the gang. In his eagerness to finally have the object of his lifelong search in his hands, Ravencroft stumbled at the finish line. He should have thanked the gang for their help and made some excuse to get rid of them before opening the chest. Considering the damage to the exterior, this would have been an easy thing to do. Ravencroft could have told them he would keep it safely at his home and call a local university on Monday to arrange for experts to pick it up so the chest could be safely opened to avoid further damaging the book inside. After all, this was his only evidence to clear Sarah Ravencroft's name, so surely he'd want to handle it with as much care as possible.
Don't call me Shirley.
Ben Ravencroft didn't exactly have to lie about this either. There are plenty of existing books from the 1600s and even older, but the reason they survived for centuries was because they were generally kept in cool, dry libraries, thus preventing the covers or pages from rotting. That's a far cry from a broken wooden chest buried in the wet earth next to a tree. Granted, this was a spell book, and one that contained the spirit of a malignant magical spirit, so perhaps the only way it could be destroyed was with fire, and Ravencroft knew that. However, the gang didn't know that, so the author had a choice between either spending the rest of the weekend showing them around town or claiming to be too overwhelmed by finding the book and asking them to leave while he recuperated alone at home. Velma and the rest would be polite enough to honor their friend's wishes. Hell, Ravencroft could have offered to pay for another meal for Shaggy and Scooby, and that alone would have been enough to get rid of them. Perhaps Ben Ravencroft had meant to quickly open the chest to ascertain its contents and free Sarah Ravencroft later when he was alone, but didn't anticipate the spellbook would look like the Necronomicon, alerting the ever-observant Velma that it was clearly something much more nefarious than a peaceful Wiccan's journal. Knowing the jig was up, Ben Ravencroft quickly flipped his switch from good to evil and immediately tried freeing his ancestor before the rest could gather their wits to stop him. It's also possible that, having researched the gang, Ravencroft knew it was only a matter of time before Shaggy or Scooby, ever the danger to historical artifacts, found a way to destroy the chest, explaining his need to move so quickly after it was unearthed.
The party's just beginning!
This also makes his toying with the gang and townsfolk that much more infuriating. If he was in such a hurry to free Sarah Ravencroft before anyone could stop him, and he had the magical ability to levitate objects and summon fire, why didn't Ben Ravencroft, you know, why didn't he just directly set Velma and the rest on fire? Ben Ravencroft is not a good guy. Did he like to play with things a while before annihilation? For having two flat tires, the Mystery Machine is handling surprisingly well for Shaggy.
What thou?
Ben Ravencroft, your descendant from the modern world.
Modern?
It's possible Ben Ravencroft wasn't a direct descendant of Sarah Ravencroft, but rather a collateral descendant, meaning Sarah could have had a sibling who had children that led directly to Ben. If Ben was a direct descendant of Sarah, that would mean there was a guy out there who, you know, at least once, with Sarah. Of course, being a witch, it's entirely possible she used a love potion or other deceitful means to procreate.
I shall create an era of darkness over this land!
I know this is supposed to be a scary moment, highlighting just how dangerous Sarah Ravencroft was, but I've got a couple of ugly old trees in my yard that kill the grass and constantly drop moldy branches after every storm, and city ordinances won't let them be removed. Frankly, this power of the witch is something I kind of envy.
Oh, I got the stuffing, Scoob. Well, time to baste this bird.
I wasn't kidding. Every time they do dress up, Scooby's the one in the dress.
We're eco-goths, kinda like Wiccans. Just ask Thorne, she is one.
Yeah, right. Sally McKnight, 1/16 blood on my mother's side.
My great-grandfather shoed horses, So I guess that makes me 1/16th blacksmith.
Thinkest thou art a Wiccan? Only a virtuous soul can imprison me.
Is it possible there was still a spark of, I don't want to say good in Ben Ravencroft because that sounds silly, but perhaps he wasn't quite as evil as he himself thought he was? Did he develop a sense of friendship with the gang that kept him from simply killing them outright? He did try to banish Sarah Ravencroft when it became clear she was incapable of being controlled and was more interested in destroying the world than ruling it.
I am out of here.
Yeah, that witch is the real thing. Wait, Thorn, we need your help.
Me? What can I do?
The next few band practices are probably going to be pretty awkward. Hey, Dusk and Luna, remember that time you guys ran off to save yourselves while leaving me behind to fight the murderous ghost witch? Perhaps it's too charitable to suggest Ben Ravencroft had the possibility of redemption. After all, just because he didn't have the stomach for murder didn't mean he wouldn't develop a taste for it later. And his failed attempt to imprison the witch was likely more an act of self-preservation than altruism. Parents often have a propensity to punish their children based on their own expectations for the child's behavior. If caught breaking a window, the straight A student might be grounded for 2 weeks, whereas their brother, who barely manages to advance a grade, might suffer no more than a timeout. This is because the former should have known better, while the latter was just a dumb kid everyone expects to screw up. I'm using this example to help explain why I'm giving Ben Ravencroft a 1 out of 5 for his operation score. He brilliantly devised the museum caper and managed to find the spellbook by manipulating the gang, but not only was the former unnecessary, he should have known better than to tip his cards at the end. Remember, he thoroughly researched Velma and the rest. That's why Ravencroft felt they were the only ones who could help solve the mystery of the missing spellbook. He should have also realized they were the only ones capable of stopping him. For their fake witch, Mayor Corey, McKnight, Jack, Willard, and Molly Parker get a final due score of 2.8 out of 5. For his real one, Ben Ravencroft, meanwhile, gets a final due score of 2.7 out of 5. Both achieved better than average ratings, but just barely. You know, it's a pity that Professor Pericles never had a chance to meet Ben Ravencroft. If he had, the evil owl might have given just a little more thought before summoning a malevolent entity with cosmic powers. And that's my ranking of the villains from Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost, the second of the 4 films that make up the Scooby-Doo Renaissance, shown here along with the ones from my previous video. I meant what I said about how disappointing it is when someone you expect better from fails to reach their potential. I couldn't care less about the Oakhaven business people and their cheap theatrics, but I was genuinely sad to see Ben Ravencroft's ranking. He's easily near the top of my list of favorite Scooby-Doo universe villains, and it felt wrong to give him such a middling score. However, no matter how cool someone is, doesn't matter if they drop the ball at the end. I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, there's a link to my Patreon below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. Patreon members receive credit in my videos for as long as they remain a paid member, as well as a personal shout out in the next regular video produced after they join. Wind and air are essentially the same thing, and they left out another important element. That song would have easily worked as earth, water, fire, and air.